The woman who walked into the Iron Globe that Friday night wore nothing that announced her presence. No uniform, no insignia, no visible markers of the world she inhabited. Just a simple gray silk blouse, dark slacks, and the kind of unassuming demeanor that made people look past her without really seeing. But she saw everything. Sarah Mitchell, 32 years old and carrying the weight of 4 combat deployments across her shoulders like an invisible cloak, had learned long ago that being underestimated was the most powerful weapon in her arsenal. She ordered a glass of water at the bar, her voice quiet and polite, and settled onto a worn leather stool in the corner where she could observe the room with the methodical precision of someone trained to assess threats in the span of a heartbeat. The Iron Globe wasn't her kind of place. It was a marine bar through and through. The kind of establishment where the walls themselves seemed to bleed eagle, globe, and anchor. Framed photographs of legendary Marines lined the walls like a gallery of American combat history. Chesty Puller's stern gaze stared down from above the cash register. Dan Daly's citation for the Medal of Honor hung beside the beer taps. The jukebox in the corner played classic rock at a volume just shy of painful, competing with the voices of 3 dozen Marines who'd gathered to celebrate, to decompress, to exist in that peculiar space between deployment and home where warriors go to remember they're still human. Mitchell wasn't here to drink. She wasn't here to socialize. She was here to observe, to understand the pulse of the culture she would be embedded with in 72 hours. The official briefings at Quantico told one story about Marine infantry culture. The unfiltered atmosphere of a place like the Iron Globe told another, often more truthful one. Her eyes moved across the room with practiced efficiency. Fire suppression system outdated. Emergency exits, one partially blocked by kegs stacked haphazardly against the wall. Bartender mid-50s, slight tremor in his left hand. That could be Parkinson's or simple exhaustion. This tribal architecture of the room revealed itself to her like a living map. Infantry Marines clustered together near the pool table, their voices loud and sharp-edged. Logistics and admin personnel occupied the booths along the far wall, quieter, more reserved. The invisible hierarchy of the Corps laid bare in the simple geography of who sat where. She cataloged it all automatically, effortlessly. Her mind trained to deconstruct complex trauma scenarios and identify critical vulnerabilities in human anatomy did the same with human terrain. This wasn't a bar. It was a living organism of pride, prejudice, and the peculiar brotherhood that comes from shared suffering. Staff Sergeant Jake Kane held court near the center of the room. His voice a booming instrument of confident masculinity that cut through the lesser conversations like a blade. He was 29, built like the recruiting poster he'd probably once aspired to be, with shoulders that seemed designed to carry the weight of the Marine Corps self-image. 3 combat deployments to Iraq and Afghanistan had etched themselves into the lines around his eyes, but they hadn't tempered the particular brand of arrogance that comes from surviving what others couldn't. He was telling a story about Fallujah, his hands carving shapes in the air, as he described a firefight that may or may not have happened exactly as he remembered it. His audience, 5 younger Marines who looked at him with the kind of reverence reserved for those who'd seen the elephant and lived to tell about it, hung on every word. It took him nearly 15 minutes to notice the woman at the bar. When he did, his narrative stuttered, then stopped. He cocked his head, studying her with the kind of casual appraisal men sometimes give women when they believe themselves unobserved. She didn't fit. Not in her clothes, not in her demeanor, not in the quiet way she held herself apart from the testosterone-fueled chaos that surrounded her. "Hey," he called out, his voice carrying that particular tone of performative courtesy that conceals dismissal. "Ma'am, no offense, but this is kind of a devil-dog bar. The Officers Club is 2 blocks north on Hamilton Street." Mitchell didn't turn her head. Her gaze continued its slow, methodical sweep of the room. She'd heard him. She simply chose not to acknowledge that his words required a response. The silence that followed his statement wasn't complete. The jukebox still played. Other conversations continued. But something in the room shifted, a subtle change in atmospheric pressure that comes when people sense conflict brewing like a summer storm on the horizon. Kane frowned. Being ignored was worse than being challenged. It suggested a level of dismissiveness that his ego couldn't quite process. He pushed away from his group and moved toward the bar, his gait loose and confident. A man who'd never seriously considered the possibility that he might be wrong about something fundamental. "Ma'am," he said again, louder this time, positioning himself directly in her line of sight. "I'm trying to be polite here. You're kind of cramping our vibe. This is where we come to decompress before deployment. It's a Marine thing. I'm sure you understand." Mitchell's eyes finally moved to him. It wasn't a quick glance. It was a slow, deliberate assessment that started at his boots and traveled upward, cataloging details with clinical precision. Boots well worn but maintained. Jeans civilian but fitted in a way that suggested someone who stayed in fighting shape. T-shirt with a faded USMC logo stretched across a chest that spoke of countless hours in the base gym. The tattoo on his forearm, eagle globe, an anchor with a scroll that read Fallujah 2007. When her eyes finally reached his face, she held his gaze for exactly 3 seconds, long enough to acknowledge him, short enough to make clear she wasn't impressed. "I'm having a drink," she said. Her voice was quiet, almost soft, but it carried a quality of absolute certainty that comes from someone who's made life and death decisions under conditions that would break most people. "Is there a law against that, Sergeant?" The use of his rank surprised him. She'd read it from something. His bearing, probably, or the way the younger Marines deferred to him. Kane's frown deepened. "Look, lady, I don't know who you are, but you're in civilian clothes at a Marine bar. That's either stolen valor territory or you're waiting for someone. If you're waiting for your Marine husband, he's probably at the real bar with his unit, not here with the enlisted guys." The words came out harsher than he'd intended, sharpened by alcohol and the audience of younger Marines who were watching to see how their sergeant handled this unexpected intrusion into their sacred space. Mitchell turned back to her water glass. "I'm not waiting for anyone, Sergeant Kane. I'm exactly where I intend to be." The fact that she'd used his name, which she shouldn't have known, sent a small ripple of unease through his confidence. But he'd committed now gone too far down this road to back away without losing face in front of his Marines. "Then you're lost," he said, his voice taking on an edge. "And I'm trying to help you before this gets uncomfortable. This place isn't for civilians. It's for Marines. It's for people who've earned the right to drink here by bleeding in places you've never heard of." He reached out, not quite touching her shoulder, but making a gesture that suggested he was about to physically escort her toward the door. It was a move designed to assert dominance, to make clear that his authority in this space was absolute. It was also the moment when the universe intervened with the kind of dramatic timing that seems impossible except when it's actually happening. The sound came from a corner booth, a wet, ragged cough that cut through the ambient noise of the bar like a knife. Then a crash as someone's weight hit the table, sending bottles tumbling to the floor in a cascade of shattering glass. Master Gunnery Sergeant Rodriguez, 71 years old and carrying the weight of 3 wars in the deep lines of his weathered face, had just tried to swallow a piece of steak without chewing it properly. Now he was clawing at his throat, his face transitioning from its usual ruddy tan to a deep, alarming shade of purple that spoke of oxygen deprivation and imminent catastrophe. The bar erupted into chaos. Marines jumped to their feet, chairs scraping back. Someone shouted to call 911. A young corporal who'd taken a combat lifesaver course 6 months ago rushed forward and began slapping Rodriguez on the back. A well-intentioned but useless gesture that accomplished nothing except wasting precious seconds. Kane froze. For all his combat experience, for all his training, the sudden medical emergency short-circuited his ability to act. He stood there watching Rodriguez's desperate struggle for air, his mind unable to shift gears from confrontation with a civilian woman to crisis management. But Mitchell's mind made the transition in the space between heartbeats. She placed her water glass on the bar with a soft, deliberate click that somehow carried through the chaos. She moved not with haste, but with a chilling efficiency that suggested every motion had been calculated 3 steps ahead. Her path through the crowd was like a blade through water. Marines parting before her, without fully understanding why they were moving aside. Kane found himself stumbling backward, physically displaced by her presence, even though she hadn't touched him. There was something in the way she moved, a quality of absolute purpose that his combat-trained instincts recognized and automatically deferred to. She reached Rodriguez's booth and dropped to one knee beside the choking man. Her hands moved to his carotid artery fingers, finding the pulse point with the precision of someone who'd done this exact assessment hundreds of times under worse conditions. "Lay him down," she said. Her voice cut through the noise with surgical clarity. It wasn't a request. It wasn't a suggestion. It was a command delivered with such authority that Marines who outranked her by decades found themselves immediately complying. Two corporals grabbed Rodriguez under the arms and lowered him to the floor. Mitchell knelt beside him, her hands moving to his throat with clinical precision. The crowd pressed closer, drawn by the drama, but she ignored them completely. Her entire world had narrowed to the anatomy before her and the rapidly closing window of time she had to save a dying man's life. She tilted Rodriguez's head back, opened his mouth, and looked down his throat. The obstruction was visible, a piece of steak lodged in his larynx, too far down to reach with fingers, too large to dislodge with back blows. He had maybe 2 minutes before brain death began. Maybe less. The Heimlich maneuver wouldn't work on a man this size who was already unconscious. Traditional airway management required equipment she didn't have. But she'd been in situations like this before, in places where improvisation wasn't just preferred, it was survival. "I need a knife," she said, her voice still calm, still controlled. "A sharp knife, the sharpest you have. And whiskey, something with high alcohol content." Kane stared at her in disbelief. "Lady, what the hell are you talking about? A knife? What are you going to do? Perform surgery in a bar?" "I'm going to perform a cricothyrotomy," she replied without looking up from Rodriguez. "If I don't, he'll be dead in 90 seconds. Now get me that knife." The word cricothyrotomy hung in the air like a foreign language. Most of the Marines had never heard it before. But something in the absolute certainty of her voice, the clinical precision of her movements, the way she'd taken command of the situation without asking permission, began to shift the dynamic in the room. Someone pushed forward with a steak knife from the kitchen. Someone else thrust a bottle of Jack Daniels into her hands. Mitchell examined the knife briefly, testing its sharpness against her thumb. It would do. She poured whiskey over the blade, a crude but effective sterilization technique, then looked up at the circle of faces surrounding her. "I need light and I need space. Everyone except you." She pointed at Kane, back up 3 feet. Kane found himself kneeling across from her, close enough to see the steady focus in her eyes, close enough to realize that whatever was happening here was far beyond his understanding or control. She positioned the knife above Rodriguez's throat, finding the anatomical landmarks with her fingertips. The cricothyroid membrane, the small space between the thyroid and cricoid cartilages where emergency airway access could be achieved without hitting major blood vessels or nerves. Her hands were absolutely steady. Every eye was fixed on her, watching something none of them had ever witnessed outside of war zones. Kane stood frozen at the edge of the crowd, watching with a mixture of horror and awe as the woman he tried to throw out of the bar tilted Rodriguez's head back, her fingers probing the soft tissue of his throat with the confidence of someone who'd mapped this anatomy in darkness under fire in conditions where a single mistake meant death. She found the cricoid cartilage, the small ring of cartilage just below the Adam's apple. Her left hand stabilized Rodriguez's throat. Her right hand brought the whiskey-sterilized blade to bear. What happened next took less than 30 seconds, but it would replay in the minds of everyone present for the rest of their lives. The incision was swift, decisive, and absolutely precise. A half-inch horizontal cut through skin and tissue, targeting the cricothyroid membrane with the accuracy of someone who'd performed this procedure so many times that her hands knew the anatomy better than her eyes. Blood welled up dark and viscous, but the cut was controlled surgical despite the improvised nature of the tools. She used the handle of the steak knife to dilate the opening, her movements economical and practiced. Then she took a simple drinking straw from a nearby glass, bit off the flexible portion with her teeth, and inserted the rigid tube into the incision she'd created. An improvised endotracheal tube, a field-expedient airway, the kind of desperate measure taught in special operations medical courses and practiced in scenarios that most people pray they'll never encounter in reality. She leaned down, placed her mouth over the end of the straw, and began to breathe for the dying man. 1 breath, controlled and measured. Rodriguez's chest rose. 2 breaths. The ghastly blue-gray color of his face began to recede, replaced by a pale but living pink. The room existed in a vacuum of sound. Every Marine stood frozen witnesses to an act of medical savagery and grace that defied everything they understood about their world. They watched as this quiet woman in civilian clothes breathed life back into one of their legends, watched as her calm, methodical competence held the line between existence and oblivion. On the fourth breath, Rodriguez's body convulsed. He coughed violently, a horrible wet sound that nevertheless meant air was moving. The piece of steak that had nearly killed him shot out of his mouth, propelled by the force of his body's desperate attempt to clear the obstruction. He took a shuddering, ragged breath on his own, then another. The improvised airway tube in his throat whistled slightly with each inhalation, but air was moving. Oxygen was flowing. Cells that had been dying were now receiving the fuel they needed to survive. The silence in the bar finally broke with a collective exhalation, as if every man in the room had been holding his breath in sympathy with Rodriguez's struggle. Someone whispered, "Holy shit." Someone else was already on the phone with 911, explaining to the dispatcher that they needed an ambulance, but that the emergency had been stabilized by someone who knew what they were doing. Mitchell remained kneeling beside Rodriguez, monitoring his breathing, checking his pulse, maintaining the kind of vigilant assessment that comes from years of keeping people alive when everything around them was trying to kill them. She didn't stand up. She didn't acknowledge the stares. She simply did what needed to be done with the quiet competence of someone who'd found herself in similar situations more times than she cared to count. Master Chief Thomas Wade emerged from the crowd like a ghost materializing from the shadows. At 54, he moved with the careful economy of motion that comes from 3 decades of military service and the kind of injuries that accumulate when a man's job involves being shot at on a regular basis. His face was impassive, but his eyes held something that looked like recognition and deep, fundamental respect. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of absolute authority. "Everyone who isn't helping, back off. Give her room to work." The crowd parted before him, Marines stepping aside not because of his rank. They couldn't see his insignia in civilian clothes, but because of something harder to define. Command presence, perhaps, or simply the aura of someone who'd earned the right to give orders in any circumstance. Wade knelt beside Mitchell, close enough to speak quietly without being overheard. "Doc, you need anything else?" "A proper airway kit would be nice," she replied without looking up from Rodriguez. "But this'll hold until the paramedics get here." Wade studied her profile, noting the steady hands, the clinical focus, the way she'd taken control of a life or death situation and made it look routine. "Outstanding work," he said quietly. "Where'd you learn to do a crick like that?" "Kandahar, mostly," she replied, "though I perfected the technique in Ramadi." Wade's eyebrows rose almost imperceptibly. "Navy, Marine Corps," she corrected. "Medical officer attached to 3rd Marines. For deployments, mostly trauma surgery in forward positions." Wade was quiet for a long moment, processing information that explained everything he'd just witnessed. Then he spoke again, and his voice carried something that sounded like pride. "Lieutenant Commander Dr. Sarah Mitchell," Wade said, and it wasn't a question. "Garrett Wade, Master Chief, Navy Special Warfare. I think we served in some of the same places." Mitchell finally looked up from Rodriguez, meeting Wade's eyes directly. "Master Chief Wade," she said, and there was warmth in her voice for the first time that evening. "Small world. Getting smaller every day." Document Wade glanced around the bar, taking in the circle of Marines who were staring at Mitchell with expressions that ranged from awe to embarrassment. "Looks like you've had an interesting evening." "Just another Friday night," Mitchell replied, turning her attention back to Rodriguez, who was now breathing steadily through the improvised airway. The sound of sirens grew louder, approaching through the Virginia night. Emergency medical services, summoned by frantic phone calls, racing toward a crisis that had already been resolved by someone with better training and steadier hands than most people would encounter in a lifetime. Kane stood at the edge of the crowd, his face pale, his earlier confidence completely evaporated. He'd spent the last hour trying to intimidate and dismiss a woman who'd just performed emergency surgery on a bar floor with improvised tools. The magnitude of his mistake was beginning to sink in, and with it came the crushing weight of humiliation and the growing realization that he'd badly misjudged someone who represented everything he claimed to respect about military service. As the paramedics burst through the door with their equipment and their trained urgency, Wade stood and gestured them toward Rodriguez. "Patient stable," he announced. "Airway's been secured by a Navy surgeon. You'll want to transport for definitive care, but she's got him breathing." The lead paramedic, a veteran EMT who'd seen everything the civilian world had to offer, took one look at the improvised cricothyrotomy and whistled low under his breath. "Who did this?" he asked. "That woman," Wade replied, nodding toward Mitchell, who was now giving a precise medical report to the second paramedic. "She's military. Special Operations medical training." The paramedic nodded, understanding immediately. He'd worked enough trauma cases involving military personnel to recognize surgical competence when he saw it. "Clean work," he said, examining the airway. "Textbook placement. She probably saved his life." "She did save his life," Wade corrected. Rodriguez was loaded onto a gurney with professional efficiency, the improvised airway carefully maintained during transport. As they wheeled him toward the ambulance, he managed to catch Mitchell's eye and mouth the words "thank you." She nodded once, a small gesture of acknowledgement between professionals who understood that sometimes saving lives was just part of the job. The bar slowly returned to something resembling normal as the emergency vehicles departed, their sirens fading into the distance. But normal was a relative term. Everyone present had just witnessed something that would become part of their personal mythology, the kind of story they'd tell for decades in barracks and at reunions, and to their children when they asked what real heroes looked like. Mitchell returned to her stool at the bar, where her water glass waited exactly where she'd left it. She picked it up, took a small sip, and resumed her quiet observation of the room as if the last 20 minutes had been nothing more than a minor interruption in her evening. Kane approached slowly, his earlier swagger replaced by something that looked suspiciously like humility. He stopped about 3 feet away, close enough to speak, but far enough to show respect. "Ma'am, I need to apologize. I was completely out of line. I made assumptions that were wrong and disrespectful." Mitchell turned to look at him. Her expression wasn't angry. It wasn't even particularly judgmental. It was simply assessing, like she was cataloging him the same way she'd cataloged the bar when she first walked in. "You were sergeant," she said quietly. "But you're young. You'll learn." Wade stepped forward, and now his expression had shifted again. The warmth was gone, replaced by something that looked very much like a commanding officer about to deliver unpleasant news. "Kane," he said, his voice carrying that particular tone of authority that transcends civilian status and speaks directly to military hierarchy. "You're deploying to Helmand Province in 72 hours with MARSOC, 2nd Battalion." "Yes," Master Chief Kane managed. "Mitchell is your surgical support attachment. Your life and the lives of every Marine in your platoon may very well depend on her. I suggest you remember this moment when you're bleeding out in some Afghan village, and she's the only thing standing between you and a body bag." The words hung in the air like a sentence handed down by a particularly unforgiving judge. Kane's face somehow managed to get even paler. "Yes, Master Chief," he said again, and this time his voice was barely above a whisper. Wade held his gaze for a moment longer, then nodded curtly and turned back to Mitchell. The transformation in his demeanor was immediate and absolute. The hard-edged Master Chief vanished, replaced by something that looked very much like paternal pride. "Walk with me, Doc?" he asked, and it wasn't really a question. Mitchell nodded. She pulled a $20 bill from her pocket, placed it on the bar next to her untouched water glass, and followed Wade toward the back exit. As they walked through the crowd, Marines parted before them like water around a ship's prow, their eyes tracking Mitchell's movement with a mixture of awe and newfound respect. At the door, Wade paused and turned back to the room. His eyes swept across the assembled Marines' cataloging faces, assessing reactions. When he spoke, his voice carried to every corner of the bar. "Gentlemen, you just witnessed something most people never see. You saw a professional operating at the absolute peak of her capability. You saw competence without ego, skill without swagger, the kind of quiet excellence that saves lives when everything else fails." He paused, letting the words settle. "Remember this night. Remember what real strength looks like. It doesn't always come in the package you expect." Then he and Mitchell were gone, leaving behind a bar full of Marines who would spend the rest of their lives telling the story of the night a Navy surgeon saved Rodriguez's life with a steak knife and a drinking straw. The bar owner, a former Marine himself who'd watched the entire event from behind the taps, moved slowly toward the security camera monitor. He rewound the footage, found the perfect frame of Mitchell kneeling over Rodriguez, her face serene and focused despite the chaos around her. He took a screenshot, printed it in high resolution, and had it framed by morning. By sunset the next day, it hung on the wall of the Iron Globe, right next to the photograph of Chesty Puller receiving the Navy Cross. There was no plaque, no explanation. There didn't need to be. Every Marine who walked through those doors knew the story. Kane remained at the bar long after his friends had left, nursing a beer that had gone warm in his hands. He stared at his reflection in the mirror behind the bottles, seeing not the confident sergeant who'd walked in that evening, but someone smaller. Someone who'd just had his entire worldview shattered by a woman who weighed maybe 120 soaking wet. His phone buzzed. A text message from an unknown number. 0600 hours. Building 452 Quantico. Pre-deployment briefing. Don't be late. LCDR Mitchell. He stared at the message for a long moment, then typed a response with fingers that felt numb. Yes, ma'am. I'll be there. Outside in the parking lot, Wade and Mitchell stood beside his truck, the Virginia night air cool and clean after the stale atmosphere of the bar. You okay, Sarah? Wade asked, his voice gentle now, stripped of the command authority he'd wielded inside. I'm fine, Thomas, she said. Not the first time I've been underestimated. Won't be the last. That Marine Kane, Wade said, he's green, good soldier, but carrying around a lot of stupid ideas about what makes a warrior. I'll fix that, Mitchell said simply. In Hellman, Wade studied her face in the dim light of the parking lot. He'd known her for 6 years, had trained her in the brutal arts of combat medicine, had watched her evolve from a talented but uncertain young surgeon into one of the finest battlefield physicians he'd ever encountered. She was in many ways the legacy he'd never expected to have. You know, he said quietly, what you did in there with Rodriguez. That was the same procedure I taught you in Afghanistan. The one I learned the hard way in Grenada. I know. I was thinking about that the whole time. Your hands over mine showing me the anatomy in the dark. Trust the landmarks. Document, trust your training. You did it perfectly, Wade said. Better than I ever did. I had a good teacher. Wade's phone buzzed. He glanced at it, then back at Mitchell. Rodriguez is stable at the hospital. Good, Mitchell said. He'll need a proper airway replacement in the morning, but he'll be fine. Wade put his arm around her shoulders, a gesture of protection and pride. Come on, document. Let me buy you a real drink somewhere they appreciate Navy medical officers. Mitchell smiled, the first genuine expression of warmth she'd shown all evening. I'd like that, Master Chief. By morning, every Marine at Quantico would know about the Navy surgeon who'd saved Rodriguez's life. By the end of the week, the story would spread to Camp Lejeune, to Camp Pendleton, to every Marine base where warriors gathered to share the legends that define their culture. They would get some of the details wrong. They always did. The knife would become a kbar in some versions. The whiskey would become vodka. The straw would become a pen tube. But the core of the story would remain true. A woman walked into a Marine bar. She was underestimated, dismissed, nearly thrown out. And then when death came calling, she stood between a dying warrior and the darkness with nothing but improvised tools and the kind of competence that comes from doing the impossible. So many times it becomes routine. It was the kind of story Marines understood, the kind they respected, the kind they would tell for generations, long after everyone involved had turned to dust. And in 72 hours, Staff Sergeant Jake Kane would deploy to Afghanistan, carrying with him the weight of his mistake and the beginning of an education about what real strength looked like. The lesson had been delivered. Now came the part where he learned to apply it. In a war zone where mistakes didn't just bruise egos, they filled body bags. The Afghan sun rose over forward operating base Dalarum like a hammer striking an anvil, turning the desert landscape into a shimmering testament to man's capacity for enduring misery. The heat came in waves that distorted the air, making the distant mountains ripple like water, transforming solid earth into liquid mirage. Lieutenant Commander Sarah Mitchell stepped off the CH-47 Chinook into this furnace, wearing full combat gear, her medical pack strapped across her shoulders with the kind of careful precision that spoke of countless iterations of this exact moment. The rotor wash kicked up dust devils that scoured exposed skin like sandpaper, But she moved through it without hesitation, her eyes already scanning the forward operating base with the same analytical precision she'd brought to the Iron Globe 3 days earlier. FOB Delarum wasn't much to look at. A collection of prefabricated structures surrounded by HESCO barriers filled with sand and gravel ringed by guard towers that watched the approaches with the paranoid vigilance of an organism that knew it existed in hostile territory. Razor wire gleamed in the brutal sunlight. The smell of diesel fuel, burning trash, and unwashed humanity hung in the air like an invisible fog. Major Robert Hayes waited at the landing zone, his uniform already dark with sweat despite the early hour. He was 42 career infantry with the kind of face that had forgotten how to smile somewhere between Fallujah and Sanjin. He rendered a crisp salute as Mitchell approached. "Commander Mitchell, welcome to Delarum. I wish I could say it gets better, but I'd be lying." "Major Hayes," Mitchell replied, returning the salute. "I'm not here for the accommodations." Hayes's mouth twitched. Not quite a smile, but close. "Good, because we're about 20 miles from the nearest Starbucks, and the pool's under renovation." He gestured toward a cluster of structures. "Your quarters are in Building 3. You'll be bunking with the corpsmen. As for your assignment, you're embedded with 2nd Platoon Bravo Company, Staff Sergeant Kane's unit." Mitchell's expression didn't change, but something flickered in her eyes. "I'm aware, sir. I heard about the incident at the Iron Globe," Hayes said quietly as they walked. "Word travels fast in the Corps. Kane knows you're coming. He's been walking on eggshells for 3 days, which is probably good for his character development." "Character development is not my primary mission objective, Major. Keeping Marines alive is. I understand. But out here, those two things tend to overlap." Hayes stopped outside a plywood structure that served as the company command post. "Commander, I'm going to be straight with you. My Marines don't like outsiders. They especially don't like Navy attachments, and they've got some outdated ideas about women in combat roles. You're facing an uphill battle for acceptance." Mitchell set down her pack with a soft thud that raised a small cloud of dust. "Sir, with respect, I'm not here to win a popularity contest. I'm here to provide trauma surgical capability in support of combat operations. Whether your Marines like me is irrelevant. Whether they trust me when one of them is bleeding out is all that matters." Hayes studied her for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "Master Chief Wade said you were direct. He also said you're the best combat surgeon he's ever seen. And Wade doesn't hand out compliments like candy. So here's how this works. You'll accompany 2nd Platoon on their operations. You'll have final medical authority on all trauma cases. And if any of my Marines give you grief that crosses the line, you come to me." "Crystal clear, sir. Platoon brief is at 1,400 hours. Get settled. Get some chow, and try not to let the heat kill you before the Taliban get a chance." The platoon brief took place in a sweltering plywood room that smelled of sweat, gun oil, and the peculiar combination of boredom and anxiety that characterized life on a forward operating base. 32 Marines sat on folding chairs or stood along the walls, their faces showing various degrees of skepticism, curiosity, and resignation as they processed the news that their surgical support would be a Navy officer who happened to be female. Kane stood at the front of the room, his posture rigid with the kind of military bearing that comes from someone trying very hard to project confidence they don't actually feel. He'd spent the last 3 days thinking about the Iron Globe, replaying every moment of his encounter with Mitchell, trying to understand how badly he'd misjudged her. The weight of that mistake and the implications for his Marines sat on his shoulders like physical mass. "Ma'am, I owe you a better apology than the one I gave at the bar. What I said and how I acted was unprofessional and inexcusable. It won't happen again." Mitchell studied him for a moment. "Sergeant Kane, I don't need apologies. I need you to lead your Marines effectively and trust me to do my job when it matters. Can you do that?" "Yes, ma'am. Absolutely." "Then we're good. What's the patrol schedule?" "We step off at 0600 tomorrow. Village clearing operation about 5 clicks north. Known Taliban activity in the area. High IED threat on the approach routes." "I'll be ready." Kane hesitated, then spoke again, his voice lower. "Ma'am, some of the younger Marines, they're still skeptical. They don't understand what you can do. They didn't see what happened at the Iron Globe. They will," Mitchell said simply. "Not in a bar scenario, but when someone's bleeding out." The first patrol came at dawn. 33 bodies moving through the desert in a tactical column, that maintained spacing and sectors of fire with the practiced discipline of men who knew that complacency killed. Mitchell moved with second squad positioned in the middle of the formation where she could respond quickly to casualties at either end of the column. She carried 60 pounds of gear, body armor, helmet, M4 rifle sidearm, and a medical pack that contained enough trauma supplies to handle multiple casualties. The weight distributed across her smaller frame in a way that the male Marines around her noticed and judged, wondering how long she could maintain the pace. 3 hours later, as they approached the first village checkpoint, she was still moving with the same economical efficiency she'd shown at the start. No complaints, no requests for rest, just quiet competence that slowly began to shift the calculations happening in the minds of the Marines around her. Corporal Mike Santos, 2nd Squad's pointman, signaled a halt. The column froze, every Marine dropping into a knee or prone position based on their sector of responsibility. Mitchell went prone behind a low berm, her rifle oriented toward a compound wall 30 meters distant, her eyes scanning for threats while her mind cataloged the terrain for potential casualty collection points if things went wrong. Kane moved forward to Santos's position. They conferred in low voices. Then Kane signaled for Mitchell to join them. She low-crawled forward, her movement smooth despite the gear and the uneven ground. "What have you got, Corporal?" she asked quietly. Santos pointed to a section of road ahead where the dirt looked disturbed. The pattern inconsistent with normal vehicle traffic. "Possible IED, ma'am. The way the dirt's displaced, and there's fresh digging on the shoulder. Could be nothing. Could be a pressure plate connected to about 50 pounds of homemade explosive." Mitchell studied the area, then scanned the surrounding terrain. Her combat medical training included IED recognition because casualties and explosive devices went hand in hand. The culvert on the right about 40 m past the disturbed area. That's where they'll stage the secondary device if this is an ambush. Santos looked at her with surprise. "You've done route clearance before, ma'am. EOD training is part of Special Operations Medical School," she replied. "If you're going to treat blast casualties, you need to understand how the weapons work." Kane made the decision to bypass the suspected IED location, leading the patrol on a longer route that added an hour to their movement, but kept his Marines out of a potential kill zone. As they moved through the detour, he found himself thinking about Mitchell's casual knowledge of explosive devices, adding it to the growing list of things she knew that he'd never expected. The IED detonated with a characteristic thunderclap of homemade explosive, a sound that bypassed the ears and went straight to the chest cavity, compressing lungs and stopping hearts for terrified seconds. The blast wave rippled outward, carrying shrapnel and superheated air that turned anything in its path into casualties. The vehicle-borne IED had been parked along their route, waiting for exactly the right moment to maximize casualties. The Taliban triggermen had timed it perfectly. The blast caught 2nd Squad in the open. Nowhere to hide, nowhere to run. When the dust cleared 3 seconds later, the scene was chaos incarnate. 2 Marines down, possibly 3, screaming, someone calling for corpsmen. The sharp crack of incoming AK-47 fire as Taliban fighters used the confusion to launch a coordinated ambush. Mitchell's training took over with the smooth certainty of muscle memory refined through countless iterations. She was moving before conscious thought, her body executing the actions while her mind cataloged priorities. Corporal Santos lay 15 meters ahead, his left leg shredded from mid-thigh down femoral artery, spurting blood in rhythmic pulses that painted the Afghan dirt in spreading crimson pools. Critical minutes to exsanguination if not controlled. Lance Corporal Danny Nash was on his side clutching his chest, his face contorted in pain and his breathing rapid and shallow. Possible tension pneumothorax from blast overpressure. Critical, but slightly more time than Santos. The platoon corpsman HM2 Rodriguez was down and not moving, blood pooling beneath his helmet. Status unknown but non-responsive. Incoming fire intensified. Rounds snapped overhead with a distinctive crack of supersonic passage. Marines returned fire, establishing a base of fire to suppress the Taliban attack, but the situation was degrading rapidly. Kane's voice cut through the chaos calm despite the circumstances. "Get me suppressive fire on that tree line." 2nd Squad pulled back to the hard stand. Somebody get to those casualties. I'm going, Mitchell shouted, already moving. She sprinted toward Santos, her medical pack bouncing against her back, her body instinctively keeping low despite the weight of gear that fought her every step. Rounds impacted around her, kicking up small geysers of dirt. But she'd learned long ago that fear was a luxury she couldn't afford when someone was bleeding out. She reached Santos and went to her knees beside him, her hands already moving to his leg. The damage was catastrophic. Shrapnel had shredded muscle, shattered bone, and most critically had torn the femoral artery. His leg was still attached, but barely, and the blood loss was going to kill him in under 3 minutes if she didn't act. Santos, stay with me. I've got you. Her voice was command, not comfort, designed to cut through shock and pain. His eyes found hers wide with terror and pain. Ma'am, I can't feel my leg. You're going to be fine. Look at me, not at your leg. Look at my eyes. She applied a tourniquet above the wound site, cranking it tight until the arterial bleeding stopped. The improvised pressure bandage followed, packed into the wound cavity with the kind of aggressive trauma management that looked violent but saved lives. Kane appeared beside her, his rifle oriented outward to provide security. What do you need from me? He shouted over the gunfire. Hold this pressure dressing. Don't let up no matter what. She moved to Nash, whose breathing had become increasingly labored. The chest wound was classic blast trauma, possible collapsed lung, possible internal bleeding. She needed to decompress his chest cavity, and she needed to do it now. Nash, I'm going to put a needle in your chest. It's going to hurt, but it'll help you breathe. She located the anatomical landmarks, found the intercostal space, and inserted a 14-gauge needle between his ribs. The release of pressure was immediate and dramatic. Air hissed out through the needle as his collapsed lung re-expanded. Nash's breathing eased almost immediately, color returning to his face. Move him to cover behind that wall, she told Kane. Keep him sitting up. Don't lay him flat. The incoming fire slackened as Marine marksmanship began to take its toll on the Taliban fighters. But Mitchell was already moving toward the third casualty, the corpsman who hadn't moved since the blast. HM2 Williams was unconscious, blood trickling from his ears, his breathing shallow and irregular. Head trauma, possibly severe. She checked his pupils, assessed his responsiveness, monitored his vitals with the practiced efficiency of someone who'd triaged hundreds of trauma cases. He was stable for now, but he needed immediate evacuation to a surgical facility. Kane found her kneeling beside Williams, her hands moving through a systematic assessment that seemed to catalog every injury with clinical precision. How bad is it? He asked. He'll live if we get him to surgery in the next 2 hours, she replied. But he needs a neurosurgeon, not a field medic. Kane was already on the radio, calling for medical evacuation, coordinating with higher headquarters for immediate air support. As he spoke into the handset, he watched Mitchell move between the 3 casualties with fluid efficiency, adjusting bandages, monitoring vital signs, making the kind of life or death decisions that separated competent medics from surgical specialists. The CH-53 appeared on the horizon 20 minutes later, its rotors beating the air like mechanical thunder. The landing zone had been secured, the Taliban fighters driven off by superior firepower and the kind of aggressive tactics that Marine infantry used to establish dominance in any engagement. Mitchell supervised the loading of all 3 casualties, providing detailed medical reports to the flight medic, ensuring continuity of care during transport. As the helicopter lifted off carrying her patients toward definitive surgical care, she turned back to Kane and his Marines. They were looking at her differently now. The skepticism had been replaced by something harder to define, but much more valuable. Respect. Trust. The bone-deep certainty that when things went wrong, she would be there and she would do whatever it took to bring them home alive. Outstanding work, Doc, Kane said, using the informal title that marked acceptance into the tight brotherhood of combat veterans. Santos owes you his life. Nash too, probably. Just doing my job, Sergeant, she replied, but there was warmth in her voice. The same warmth she'd shown Wade in the parking lot of the Iron Globe 3 days earlier. They're your Marines. Getting them home alive is what I'm here for. The patrol back to FOB Delaram was quiet Marines processing what they'd experienced, what they'd witnessed, What they'd learned about the woman who joined their platoon 3 weeks ago with a resume full of credentials they'd initially dismissed as inflated Navy propaganda. They'd seen her under fire now, seen her hands stay steady while rounds cracked overhead, seen her make decisions in seconds that meant the difference between life and death, seen her operate with a calm competence that defied the chaos surrounding her. The skepticism was gone, burned away in the crucible of combat, and replaced with something harder, more valuable. Respect, trust, the bone-deep certainty that when things went wrong, she would be there and she would do whatever it took to bring them home alive. That night, as Mitchell cleaned her equipment and restocked her medical kit, Kane found her in the medical supply room. He stood in the doorway for a moment, watching her work with the same methodical precision she brought to everything. "Commander Mitchell, got a minute?" "Of course, Sergeant. What do you need?" He stepped inside, closing the door behind him. "I wanted to say thank you for today, for Santos and Nash, for showing me what I should have seen from the beginning." "You're welcome, but you don't owe me thanks for doing my job." "It's more than that, ma'am. I owe you an apology that's bigger than the one I gave after the bar. I didn't just underestimate you. I disrespected you. I dismissed everything you'd accomplished because it didn't fit my narrow idea of what a warrior looks like. And today, you proved that my idea was not just wrong, but dangerous. If I kept thinking that way, if I hadn't learned to trust you, Santos and Nash would be dead." Mitchell set down the equipment she'd been organizing and looked at him directly. "Sergeant Kane, you're not the first person to underestimate me, and you won't be the last. But here's what matters. When it counted, when your Marines needed you to trust me, you did. You held that tourniquet exactly like I showed you. You kept Nash conscious. You helped me save both of them. That's leadership. That's what I need from you going forward. You've got it, ma'am. No hesitation, no doubt. Whatever you need whenever you need it. I trust you to do that." The casual confidence in her voice, the absolute certainty that he would execute his mission when it mattered, hit Kane harder than any rebuke could have. 6 months ago, she'd had every reason to doubt him. Now she trusted him with her life. The weight of that trust settled on his shoulders like physical mass. "We'll be there if you need us. I know you will. Now help me stage these kits. I need 12 of them ready by tomorrow morning, and your hands are bigger than mine for carrying the heavy equipment." They worked in companionable silence for the next hour. The ease between them, a testament to how far they'd both traveled from that confrontation at the Iron Globe. Kane found himself thinking about the journey, about how profoundly wrong he'd been, about how much he'd learned from someone he'd initially dismissed as irrelevant. The operation launched at 0200 hours under a moonless sky that turned the Afghan landscape into a study in shadow and darker shadow. The assault force moved in on armored vehicles, their approach carefully coordinated to avoid known IED locations identified by days of overhead surveillance and signals intelligence. Mitchell rode in the lead vehicle. Her medical pack secured a rifle, loaded her mind running through the countless scenarios she'd prepared for over 6 years of combat deployments. Beside her sat Gunnery Sergeant Parker, the MARSOC team leader, a veteran of 17 deployments who'd worked with Navy medical personnel often enough to respect their capabilities. "Doc, when we make entry, you stay behind the breaching element until we've secured the initial rooms. Once we call clear, you come in and set up your casualty collection point in the most defensible position. If we take wounded during the breach, we'll drag them to you." "Gunny, I'll be ready." The compound materialized out of the darkness like a physical manifestation of hostility. High walls, multiple buildings, limited access points. The kind of structure that funneled attackers into kill zones and maximized defensive advantage. Intelligence suggested 15 to 20 Taliban fighters inside, all armed, all prepared to defend their commander to the death. The assault force dismounted 300 meters out, moving on foot to maintain tactical surprise. Mitchell moved with them, her footfalls silent despite the weight of gear, her breathing controlled and steady. She'd done this before. Not exactly this, but close enough that the fear was manageable, controllable, something she could function through rather than something that paralyzed. The explosives placed on the compound gate detonated with a sharp crack that shattered the night silence. And then everything was chaos and violence, and the particular brand of controlled aggression that characterized special operations combat. The assault force flowed through the breach like water, finding the path of least resistance. their movements choreographed through countless hours of training. Flashbangs detonated inside. Gunfire erupted in sharp, controlled bursts. Voices shouted in English and Pashto commands and warnings, and the verbal markers that separated friend from foe in darkness. Mitchell waited at the breach point exactly as instructed. Her heart rate elevated, but controlled her senses, hyper-focused on the sounds coming from inside the compound. She could distinguish weapon types by the reports. M4S crisp and sharp. AK-47S deeper and more ragged. The distinctive thump of an RPG launching followed by an explosion that shook dust from the walls. Dock were clear in Building 1 moving to Building 2. She entered, moving quickly to the room designated as the casualty collection point. It was an interior courtyard, partially protected by walls, but with open sky above. Not ideal, but defensible. She dropped her pack and began staging equipment with practiced efficiency, preparing for the casualties she knew were coming. They came faster than expected. The IED detonated inside Building 2 with a sound that transcended hearing and became a physical force that compressed air and stopped hearts. The blast wave rippled outward, carrying with it the shrapnel and superheated gas that transformed human bodies into trauma cases. The radio erupted with urgent calls. Multiple casualties in Building 2. Corpseman up. We need medical now. Mitchell was already moving, grabbing her aid bag, sprinting across the courtyard toward Building 2. Despite the ongoing gunfire, despite the fact that Taliban fighters were still shooting from elevated positions, despite every survival instinct that screamed at her to stay in cover, she entered Building 2 and found hell. For Marines down. The MARSOC corpsman, Petty Officer Williams, was unconscious and bleeding from a head wound. Gunnery Sergeant Parker had shrapnel wounds across his torso, but was still directing his team. 2 other Marines were down with varying degrees of trauma, but the worst was Sergeant Torres from the assault force. The IED had caught him directly, and his abdomen was a catastrophic mess of exposed viscera and uncontrolled hemorrhage. He was conscious, which was almost worse than being unconscious because it meant he could feel everything, could understand that he was looking at his own intestines spilling out across the Afghan dirt. Torres, stay with me, Mitchell commanded, dropping to her knees beside him. Her hands moved with surgical precision, assessing damage, controlling bleeding, making the kind of rapid triage decisions that separated trauma surgeons from everyone else who tried to save lives in impossible conditions. The abdominal wound was beyond field repair. He needed an operating room, a surgical team, and about 6 units of blood. What he had was a Navy surgeon with improvised tools and the kind of determination that refused to accept death as inevitable. She clamped off bleeding vessels with forceps designed for much simpler procedures. She packed the abdominal cavity with gauze to control hemorrhage and protect the exposed organs. She established for access and began pushing fluids to maintain blood pressure. All of this while gunfire echoed through the building, while Taliban fighters engaged Marines in room-to-room combat, while the outcome of the entire operation hung in the balance. Torres gripped her wrist with a hand that was already growing cold. Doc, am I going to make it? You're going to be fine. She lied with the practiced ease of someone who'd held dozens of hands in similar circumstances. Just stay awake and keep talking to me. Tell me about home. Tell me about your family. He talked about his wife, about his 2-year-old daughter, about the house they'd just bought in North Carolina. He talked while Mitchell worked, while she performed trauma surgery under conditions that would have been challenging in a hospital, impossible in a combat zone, and miraculous in the ruins of an Afghan compound under fire. 20 minutes later, the fighting stopped. Taliban resistance had been neutralized, the compound secured, the target captured or killed depending on who was asking. But for Mitchell, none of that mattered. What mattered was the man whose life she held in her hands, whose survival depended on her ability to keep him alive until medical evacuation arrived. The CH-53 touched down in a storm of dust and noise. Mitchell supervised Torres's evacuation personally, riding with him to the combat surgical hospital at Camp Bastion, maintaining his airway, monitoring his vitals, keeping him alive through sheer force of will and the kind of medical expertise that comes from years of practice in the worst conditions imaginable. 3 days later, Torres walked out of the hospital. Weak, scarred, but alive. The first thing he did was find Mitchell, and thank her for saving his life. The second thing he did was call his wife and tell her about the Navy surgeon who'd performed a miracle in an Afghan compound while bullets flew overhead. 6 months later, Mitchell stood in the medical education facility at Camp Pendleton, addressing a class of 200 Marine NCOs who'd gathered to learn about combat medicine and tactical trauma care. Behind her hung 2 photographs. One showed her kneeling over Rodriguez at the Iron Globe. The other showed Gunnery Sergeant Kane performing a perfect cricothyrotomy on a training mannequin. In the back row sat Master Chief Thomas Wade, 79, and Rodriguez, 82. Between them, the Navy Cross Wade had given her the one he had earned in Desert Storm, the one that now represented a legacy passed forward. That afternoon, news arrived from Helmand. A Marine sergeant graduate of her program had performed a cricothyrotomy under fire, saving Lance Corporal Marcus Chin Jr., the son of the private she'd saved 2 years before. When Mitchell called Chin Sr. with the news, his voice broke. "Ma'am, you saved me. You trained the Marine who saved my son. How do we thank you?" "You don't," she said quietly. "You pass it forward." That evening, alone in her office, she looked at the framed photograph from the Iron Globe. 16 names inscribed around the border. 16 Marines who'd gone home because she'd refused to accept that saving them was impossible. Her phone showed a text from Kane at Quantico. "Told your story to another 200 NCO candidates today. They get it now. Quiet competence beats loud arrogance every single time." She smiled, thinking of Wade's words from years ago. The finest warriors are teachers. They save lives through everyone they train. In Virginia, the Iron Globe still displayed her photograph beside Chesty Puller. Young Marines still gathered, still heard the story, still learned the lesson. And somewhere in Afghanistan, another Navy surgeon was saving lives using techniques she'd refined, carrying forward a tradition measured not in medals, but in the endless ripple of lives saved and knowledge passed on. One life at a time, one generation at a time. The legacy that never ends. 2 years after the Iron Globe incident became Marine Corps legend, Dr. Sarah Mitchell found herself standing in the operating theater of the new Combat Trauma Training Center at Camp Pendleton. The facility represented everything she'd envisioned during those long nights in Afghanistan, treating Marines who shouldn't have survived but did because someone had taught her the right techniques at the right moment. The center bore the unofficial name Rodriguez Hall, after the master gunnery sergeant whose life she'd saved with a steak knife and a drinking straw. He'd insisted on the dedication, claiming that his second chance at life should honor the woman who'd given it to him. The morning briefing drew 150 medical personnel from across the Marine Corps, Navy corpsmen, combat medics, and surgical residents who'd volunteered for the most demanding trauma training program in the military. Mitchell scanned their faces, seeing herself at their age, hungry for knowledge that could mean the difference between bringing Marines home alive or in flag-draped coffins. Among the trainees sat Lieutenant Commander James Chun, the son of Marcus Chun Sr., whose own son had been saved by one of Mitchell's former students. The circular nature of military service, where lives saved in one generation protected the next, never failed to humble her. The first practical exercise began with simulated casualties, training mannequins rigged with pumps and reservoirs to bleed realistic amounts of synthetic blood. But Mitchell had learned years ago that training on mannequins, however sophisticated, could never replicate the psychological pressure of operating on a conscious human being who was begging you not to let them die. That's why her program included live tissue training, using anesthetized animals to teach procedures that couldn't be practiced any other way. The room fell silent as she demonstrated a thoracotomy on a sedated pig, her hands moving through the anatomy with the same precision she'd shown that night at the Iron Globe. Every cut was deliberate, every movement economical, as she exposed the heart and lungs with surgical accuracy. "This is what you'll face when a Marine takes shrapnel to the chest," she explained to the assembled trainees. "You'll have maybe 3 minutes to open the chest, control bleeding, and restore circulation. There's no time for hesitation, no room for squeamishness, no opportunity for a second chance." Lieutenant Commander Chun raised his hand. "Ma'am, how do you maintain that level of precision under combat stress?" The question came from someone who'd never operated under fire, never felt the weight of incoming rounds while trying to save a life. Mitchell paused, considering how to explain something that couldn't really be taught, only learned through experience. You practice until the procedures become muscle memory, she said. Then you practice more until you can do them in the dark, with your hands numb from cold, while people are shooting at you. But most importantly, you remember that the person on your table trusted you with their life, and that trust is sacred. The advanced training scenarios push the students beyond their comfort zones, beyond the clean, controlled environment of hospital surgery into the chaos of battlefield medicine. They performed cricothyrotomies with improvised tools, treated sucking chest wounds with plastic wrap and tape, amputated limbs with combat tourniquets, while simulated explosions detonated around them. Some of the students broke under the pressure, overwhelmed by the intensity of decision-making when every choice could mean life or death. But others rose to the challenge, displaying the kind of composure under pressure that marked future combat surgeons. Dr. Elena Rodriguez, a young Navy surgeon fresh from residency, caught Mitchell's attention during a particularly challenging simulation. The scenario involved multiple casualties from an IED blast, each requiring different levels of triage and treatment. Rodriguez worked with methodical efficiency, prioritizing patients based on survivability rather than severity of injury, making the hard choices that combat medicine demanded. When she performed a field amputation to save a patient from exsanguination, her hands remained steady despite the psychological trauma of deliberately removing a limb from someone who was conscious and screaming. After the exercise, Mitchell pulled Rodriguez aside for a private conversation. "You did well today," she said. "That amputation was textbook perfect, even though I know it cost you emotionally." Rodriguez nodded, her face pale but determined. "It felt wrong, ma'am. Everything I learned in medical school taught me to preserve life and limb, not to cut healthy tissue. But I understood that keeping the leg meant losing the patient." "That's the hardest lesson of combat medicine," Mitchell replied. "Sometimes saving a life means accepting losses that seem unacceptable in any other context. The guilt never completely goes away, but you learn to carry it as the price of keeping people alive." The training program expanded over the following months, drawing students from allied nations who wanted to learn the techniques that had made American combat medicine the most effective in the world. British SAS medics trained alongside Australian Special Forces corpsmen, sharing knowledge and tactics that transcended national boundaries. The common thread was Mitchell's insistence on practical, hands-on training that prepared medical personnel for the worst-case scenarios they'd face in combat. Master Chief Wade, now officially retired but serving as an instructor emeritus, often visited the training center to share his decades of experience with the new generation of combat medics. His presence added gravitas to the program, the living embodiment of institutional knowledge that couldn't be found in textbooks or training manuals. He'd tell stories of treating casualties in Vietnam, Grenada, and Iraq, each anecdote carefully chosen to illustrate a specific point about battlefield medicine. During one memorable session, Wade recounted treating a Marine who'd been shot through the chest in Fallujah, describing how he'd performed the same emergency thoracotomy that Mitchell now taught as standard procedure. The key, he explained to the rapt audience, wasn't just technical proficiency, but the mental fortitude to operate on a conscious patient who was looking into your eyes and asking if he was going to die. "You learn to lie with compassion," he said. "You tell them they're going to be fine even when you know they probably won't, because hope is sometimes the only anesthetic you have." The real test of Mitchell's training program came during Operation Desert Shield, a joint training exercise that simulated large-scale combat operations in a desert environment similar to Afghanistan and Iraq. Medical personnel trained at Rodriguez Hall were embedded with combat units, providing trauma care during realistic scenarios that included live ammunition, controlled explosions, and the kind of sensory overload that characterized modern warfare. Lieutenant Commander Chen found himself treating casualties during a simulated ambush, his hands working automatically to control bleeding and establish airways, while explosions detonated around him. The training took hold, muscle memory overriding conscious thought as he performed the procedures he'd practiced hundreds of times under Mitchell's supervision. When the exercise ended and the simulated casualties stood up uninjured, he felt the same surge of satisfaction that Mitchell had described, the knowledge that his skills could mean the difference between life and death in real combat. The psychological component of combat medicine became an increasingly important part of the curriculum as Mitchell recognized that technical skill alone wasn't sufficient to create effective battlefield medics. Students underwent counseling to prepare them for the emotional trauma of watching young Marines die despite their best efforts, learning coping mechanisms that would help them process the inevitable failures that came with combat medicine. They studied case histories of medics who'd suffered psychological breakdown, understanding the warning signs of combat stress and post-traumatic stress disorder. Dr. Rodriguez emerged as one of the program's most promising graduates, her combination of technical skill and emotional resilience marking her as future leadership material. Mitchell began grooming her for deployment to Afghanistan, where she would serve as the senior medical officer for a Marine Expeditionary Unit operating in Helmand Province. The assignment represented both opportunity and risk, a chance for Rodriguez to apply her training in real combat conditions, but also exposure to the kind of psychological trauma that had broken other talented medical officers. The night before Rodriguez's deployment, Mitchell invited her for a private dinner at a restaurant overlooking the Pacific Ocean. They talked about everything except medicine, sharing stories of their backgrounds, their families, their hopes for the future. But as the evening progressed, the conversation inevitably turned to the realities of combat deployment, the challenges Rodriguez would face, and the weight of responsibility she'd carry. "You're going to see things that will change you," Mitchell said as they watched the sunset paint the ocean in shades of gold and crimson. "You're going to lose patience despite doing everything right, and you're going to blame yourself for failures that weren't your fault. The key is remembering that every life you saved justifies all the ones you couldn't." Rodriguez listened intently, understanding that this conversation represented the passage of knowledge from one generation of combat surgeons to the next. "What's the hardest part, ma'am?" she asked. "The hardest part is coming home," Mitchell replied. "Learning to live with peacetime medicine after you've operated in combat conditions. Everything seems too slow, too safe, too removed from the immediacy of life and death decisions. But you adapt, and you find ways to use your experience to train the next generation." 6 months into Rodriguez's deployment, Mitchell received regular updates on her performance. The young surgeon had already performed dozens of trauma surgeries under combat conditions, saving Marines who would have died without immediate surgical intervention. Her technical skills had translated seamlessly to battlefield conditions, but more importantly, she developed the psychological resilience necessary to function in a combat environment without losing her humanity. The turning point came during a complex operation in northern Helmand, where Rodriguez's unit was supporting a multi-battalion assault on a Taliban stronghold. The fighting was intense, with casualties mounting faster than medical evacuation could handle them. Rodriguez found herself performing emergency surgery in a bombed-out building while Taliban fighters engaged Marines less than 100 meters away, the sound of gunfire and explosions providing a deadly soundtrack to her work. The patient was Lance Corporal Michael Torres, nephew of the Sergeant Mitchell had saved in that Afghan compound years earlier. The family connection wasn't lost on anyone involved, another thread in the complex web of relationships that define military service. Torres had taken shrapnel to the abdomen, a wound pattern that Rodriguez recognized from her training at Rodriguez Hall. She performed the same procedures Mitchell had taught her, controlling bleeding, protecting vital organs, stabilizing the patient for evacuation. 24 hours later, Torres was walking around the hospital at Camp Bastion, weak but alive, another Marine who'd survived because someone had taken the time to train his surgeon properly. When Rodriguez called Mitchell to report the successful surgery, she could hear the pride and satisfaction in her former student's voice, the same emotions Mitchell had felt after saving her first combat casualty years earlier. The ripple effects of Mitchell's training program extended far beyond individual cases, influencing combat medicine doctrine throughout the Marine Corps and Navy. Techniques she'd pioneered in Afghanistan became standard procedures taught at military medical schools across the country. Her emphasis on practical, hands-on training replaced older methods that relied too heavily on textbook learning, preparing medical personnel for the realities they'd face in combat rather than idealized scenarios that bore little resemblance to battlefield conditions. Kane, now a gunnery sergeant and instructor at the School of Infantry, often brought his students to observe training at Rodriguez Hall. The young Marines would watch in amazement as medical personnel performed emergency procedures with the kind of efficiency that seemed almost supernatural. Kane would tell them the story of the Iron Globe, describing how a Navy surgeon had saved Rodriguez's life with improvised tools, emphasizing that real strength often came in unexpected packages. The story had evolved over the years, as all military legends do, with details changing and embellishments added by each successive generation of Marines who heard it. But the core message remained constant. Competence trumped assumptions, skill mattered more than appearance, and the ability to save lives under pressure was the highest form of military excellence. Young Marines would leave these sessions with a new understanding of what it meant to serve alongside medical personnel, a respect for the specialized skills that kept them alive in combat. As Mitchell approached her 20th year of military service, she found herself reflecting on the path that had led from that confrontation at the Iron Globe to her current position as one of the most influential combat surgeons in the military. The journey had been marked by countless hours of training, deployments to some of the most dangerous places on Earth, and the responsibility of keeping Marines alive in conditions that defied every principle of modern medicine. The personal cost had been significant. She'd never married, never had children, her life consumed by the demands of military service and the endless cycle of training, deployment, and recovery. But she'd found fulfillment in teaching, in passing along the knowledge and skills that could mean the difference between life and death for the next generation of military medical personnel. The Rodriguez Hall Training Center had become her legacy, a permanent institution that would continue teaching combat medicine long after she retired. The techniques she'd developed, the procedures she'd refined, the mental frameworks she'd created for operating under extreme stress, all of it would survive in the hands and minds of the students she'd trained. Dr. Rodriguez returned from her deployment with commendations for valor and a recommendation for promotion to lieutenant commander. She'd performed over 200 combat surgeries, saved countless lives, and proven that Mitchell's training methods could prepare medical personnel for the worst conditions imaginable. But more importantly, she'd maintained her humanity throughout the deployment, finding ways to process the trauma and stress without becoming callous or indifferent to the suffering around her. The ceremony promoting Rodriguez took place at Rodriguez Hall, with Master Chief Wade and the original Rodriguez both in attendance. As Mitchell pinned the new rank insignia on her former student's uniform, she felt the satisfaction that comes from watching someone exceed your highest expectations. Rodriguez had become everything Mitchell had hoped for when she first designed the training program, a combat surgeon capable of operating under impossible conditions while maintaining the compassion and skill that defined the best of military medicine. In her promotion speech, Rodriguez credited Mitchell with saving not just individual lives, but entire generations of Marines who would benefit from improved combat medicine. The training she'd received at Rodriguez Hall had prepared her for challenges no civilian medical program could have anticipated, giving her the tools and confidence necessary to operate in combat conditions that would have overwhelmed less prepared personnel. The influence of Mitchell's work extended beyond the American military, as Allied forces sent their medical personnel to train at Rodriguez Hall and adopted techniques developed in the program. British, Canadian, and Australian military medical services incorporated her procedures into their own training curricula, creating a global network of combat medics who shared common skills and approaches to battlefield medicine. The international reputation of the program attracted attention from civilian medical institutions as well, with trauma surgeons from major hospitals seeking training in techniques that had been proven effective in combat conditions. Emergency departments began adopting combat medicine protocols for treating mass casualty events, recognizing that procedures developed for battlefield use often translated effectively to civilian trauma care. Mitchell's final deployment came 5 years before her planned retirement, a request from Special Operations Command for her to serve as senior medical officer for a classified operation in Africa. The mission involved training indigenous forces in counter-terrorism operations, with Mitchell responsible for providing medical support and training local medical personnel in basic trauma care. The deployment was different from her previous combat experiences, focusing more on teaching and capacity building than direct medical intervention. But it reminded her why she'd chosen military medicine in the first place: the opportunity to use medical skills in service of larger strategic objectives, helping to create stability and security in regions torn apart by conflict and violence. Working with local medical personnel who had limited training and equipment, Mitchell rediscovered the improvisational skills that had served her so well in combat. She taught village medics to perform basic life-saving procedures using whatever materials were available, adapting combat medicine techniques to resource-poor environments where advanced medical equipment was simply unavailable. The experience reinforced her belief that effective medical care depended more on knowledge and skill than on expensive equipment, that properly trained personnel could save lives in almost any conditions if they understood fundamental principles of trauma care and emergency medicine. It was a lesson she would carry back to Rodriguez Hall, influencing the final evolution of her training program to emphasize adaptability and resourcefulness over reliance on technology. Upon returning from Africa, Mitchell began planning for retirement and the transition of Rodriguez Hall to new leadership. She'd identified several promising candidates to take over the program, including Dr. Rodriguez and other former students who'd proven themselves in combat. The selection process involved not just evaluation of their medical skills, but assessment of their ability to teach and inspire the next generation of combat medical personnel. The retirement ceremony took place on a warm spring day at Camp Pendleton, with hundreds of former students, colleagues, and military leaders gathering to honor Mitchell's 25 years of service. The speakers included Master Chief Wade, now in his 80s but still sharp and articulate, who described Mitchell as the finest combat surgeon he'd ever known and the most influential teacher in the history of military medicine. Kane, now a sergeant major and senior instructor, spoke about the impact of Mitchell's work on Marine Corps culture, how her example had changed attitudes toward medical personnel and created a new understanding of the relationship between combat effectiveness and medical capability. The Marines she'd trained had gone on to serve in leadership positions throughout the Corps, carrying with them the lessons they'd learned about competence, humility, and the value of saving lives. Rodriguez delivered the final speech, describing how Mitchell's influence had shaped not just her medical career, but her understanding of what it meant to serve others. The training program at Rodriguez Hall would continue under her leadership, evolving to meet new challenges while maintaining the fundamental principles Mitchell had established: the emphasis on practical skills, psychological resilience, and unwavering commitment to bringing Marines home alive. As the ceremony concluded and the crowd began to disperse, Mitchell found herself standing with Wade and the original Rodriguez, 3 generations of military medical personnel whose lives had been intertwined by circumstances and shaped by shared commitment to serving others. They talked quietly about the changes they'd witnessed over decades of service, the evolution of combat medicine, the technological advances that had improved casualty care, but also the timeless principles that remained constant. The Iron Globe had closed years earlier, a victim of changing demographics and economic pressures. But the photograph of Mitchell saving Rodriguez's life still hung in the Marine Corps Museum at Quantico, part of a display on the evolution of combat medicine. Young Marines would stop to read the accompanying text, learning about the Night and Navy surgeon had performed emergency surgery with improvised tools, establishing a legend that would influence military medical training for generations. Mitchell's final act before retirement was to establish an endowment fund that would ensure the long-term financial stability of the Rodriguez Hall Training Center. The fund would provide scholarships for promising medical personnel, support research into new trauma care techniques, and maintain the facility's capacity to train combat medics for whatever conflicts the future might bring. In her final interview before retiring, Mitchell was asked about her proudest achievement during 25 years of military service. She thought for a moment before answering, reflecting on the hundreds of lives she'd saved directly and the thousands more who'd been saved by people she'd trained. Her proudest achievement, she said, wasn't any individual surgery or medical innovation, but the knowledge that somewhere in the world, Marines were coming home alive because someone had taught their medic how to save lives under impossible conditions. The legacy would continue, carried forward by the doctors, corpsmen, and medics who'd learned their craft at Rodriguez Hall, who would teach the next generation just as they'd been taught, passing along the skills and knowledge that meant the difference between life and death in the places where America's military served. It was a legacy measured not in medals or commendations, but in lives saved and families kept whole, in the endless ripple effect of competence and compassion that defined the best of military medicine. Years later, when military historians studied the evolution of combat medicine in the early 21st century, they would point to Mitchell's work as a turning point, the moment when military medical training shifted from theoretical knowledge to practical application, when the lessons learned in Afghanistan and Iraq were systematized and passed on to future generations. But for the Marines who'd served with her, who'd been saved by her hands or trained by her methods, the historical significance mattered less than the simple fact that she cared enough to do the job right, to demand excellence from herself and others, to ensure that when the moment came to choose between life and death, her students would be ready to choose life. The circle remained unbroken, teacher to student, generation to generation, each passing along the sacred trust of keeping faith with those who placed their lives in military hands. In that continuity lay the true measure of Mitchell's contribution, not just to military medicine, but to the broader covenant between those who serve and those who depend on their service, the promise that competence and caring would prevail over chaos and violence, that in the darkest moments of human conflict, there would always be someone ready to stand between the wounded and the darkness, armed with skill, knowledge, and the unwavering determination to bring everyone home alive. The story that began with a confrontation in a Marine bar had become something larger, a testament to the power of competence over assumption, skill over prejudice, quiet excellence over loud arrogance. It was a story the Marine Corps would tell for generations, not just because it was dramatic or inspiring, but because it captured something essential about what it meant to serve others, to place their welfare above your own comfort, to find meaning in the sacred work of preserving life in places where death seemed to hold all the advantages. And in that telling and retelling, in the passage of the story from one generation to the next, the legacy would live on, inspiring future Marines to look beyond surface appearances, to recognize excellence wherever they found it, and to understand that the greatest strength often came in the most unexpected forms, wielded by those who sought not glory or recognition, but simply the satisfaction of a job done well, a life saved, a promise kept.